On April 15, 1935, a new type of film went on sale for the first time. It was aimed particularly at amateurs. This was part of a revolution in filmmaking, when small home movie cameras became increasingly available. As Europe descended into conflict, for the first time, ordinary people right across Britain were able to record all aspects of their lives, even at war.
The feeling that if he was the next target and lost his life, at least he'd have the film.
Because he was so interested in filmmaking, he thought he ought to make a documentary of what it was like here.
All he saw coming towards him was a ball of fire, and suddenly there was an explosion.
For the last 75 years, these extraordinary amateur films have lain undiscovered, unseen, in attics, libraries, and the vaults of film archives all over Britain. Broadcast here together for the first time, these films reveal an entirely new and uncensored personal perspective on the greatest conflict in the history of Britain. Hong Kong in 1939, one of the jewels of the British Empire. Britain was still a global superpower, controlling over 25% of the world. This empire was protected by the men and ships of the Royal Navy. Lieutenant Commander George Blundell was an officer on the heavy cruiser HMS Kent. He was also a keen amateur filmmaker. For 4 years, he made a unique personal record of Britain's war at sea.
He was an extremely charismatic person. People just seemed to gravitate towards him, and so he was in the ideal career. It was something he set his heart on as a young boy.
For 50 years after the war, George Blundell's films were only ever shown to family members. This is the first time they have been broadcast at length.
When we were children in Suffolk, particularly, it was a treat, especially in the winter. We would gather in the drawing room and the curtains would be drawn, and Dad would set up his cine film thing with the great big reels, and we would all sit on chairs and we'd be treated to a film show. Terrifying films during the Malta convoys of enormous seas, unbelievable, coming right over the bow of the ship. Taking the film was an extra effort. He felt that to document it would be a fascinating thing to do.
The early scenes of George Blundell's film capture some of his charmed life as a Royal Navy officer in the British Empire, a world that would soon be destroyed by war. For Britain faced a powerful new rival in the Far East, Japan. In 1931, Japan had invaded China and began to carve out her own empire. The Japanese army made rapid advances and Western protests fell on deaf ears. Britain's response was to protect its colonies with the ships of the Royal Navy. HMS Kent was in the 5th Cruiser Squadron, part of the Far East Fleet. In July 1939, as war clouds began to gather, George Blundell filmed in Hong Kong harbour as his ship underwent desperately needed repairs. It was also a time for the ship's crew to receive their wages, supervised by the ship's paymaster, Lieutenant Commander Coleman. Once repaired, the crew took the ship to sea. to test her guns. HMS Kent had a formidable armament. Her 8-inch guns could fire a 256-pound shell almost 17 miles.
The films that he took, probably against regulations, almost certainly against regulations. I think that possibly his senior officers who were aware that he was doing it were man enough to turn a blind eye. He used to say when he was showing the film, and there'd be a cut, he would say, "Oh, the buggers have censored that bit." So obviously there was some censorship.
On the 5th of November 1939, HMS Kent was ordered to investigate shipping in Yokohama Bay, part of Japan itself. At one point, George was even able to secretly film some Japanese naval officers as they toured the ship. Although war had broken out in Europe, Japan was not yet an enemy. Remarkably, George Blundell didn't just film his life at sea, he also kept a detailed personal diary. As news of the fighting in Europe began to filter through, he recorded the mood of his crew.
18th of June 1940. After the first shock and a slight depression, the general feeling in the ship is fight to the death, and the sailors mostly think it is bound to come right in the end. "Shan't see you for some time, lovey," is the usual comment in their letters to wife or sweetheart. Now the fight's on. I pray for our folk at home. Can they take it? I'm afraid the women and children may squeal.
Then in July 1940, the crew of HMS Kent was ordered to sail for the Mediterranean. When they arrived 3 weeks later, they were almost immediately in action.
17th of August 1940. Action stations. I collected my gas mask, life belt and camera and ran to the bridge. It really was most exciting. I've never been to a circus which I enjoyed so much. The captain was terrific in his battle bowler. I'm afraid we fired mostly for the sake of opening fire. The most exciting and awe-inspiring incident was when one of our fighters chased 4 Italians down our port side at a good height. Shortly afterwards, we witnessed 3 of them fall into the sea. 2 were like flaming rockets. They came down like great red glows with a vast trail of black smoke. A terrible sight.
The feeling that if he was the next target and lost his life, at least he'd have the film and the diaries, to record the events. I never got the impression from him that fear was something that stymied him at all. He describes terror and fear among some of the men he served with, but he never expresses it in the diaries. He never expresses fear. He was brave man.
On the 17th of September 1940, the crew of HMS Kent's luck ran out. She was attacked by a swarm of Italian planes, and one of them scored a direct hit with a torpedo. The ship had to limp back into port, and only 3 days later could George record his experiences in his diary. It's a chillingly frank account.
17th of September, 1940. I am completely hazy about the sequence of events. There was obviously a big fire raging inside as I could see a glow, and it was damned hot. I began to feel a bit choky and sleepy, and I sat down. but realised that the gas mask was pretty well useless. I felt I could sleep forever, and I remember taking a pull at myself and saying internally, "No, George Blundell, you're not going to die yet."
When it was happening and the ship was terribly badly damaged, I think he was just able to concentrate on what had to be done in order to save lives. The Kent had been hit by around the area of the rudder, and all the electrics were out on the ship, and water pouring in, and the steerage had gone. His job was to keep calm and try and keep other people calm and organise these repair parties, especially the electrical repair, and he had to get some rams down to try and straighten the tiller.
The full impact of the devastating torpedo attack only became apparent when George was able to get into the damaged parts of the ship. What he found was horrifying.
As I stepped through the cabin door, I squelched on something flabby. And in the torchlight, I saw it was the body of Petty Officer Masters. I remember thinking that's the first dead man I've ever seen. The half-deck looked like the end of the world. A terrible stink of dead men and oil fuel. Bodies hanging over pipes and trunks, or huddled in a hapless heap.
33 of his shipmates were killed that day. For his bravery in helping to save the ship and its crew, George was awarded the OBE.
He knew all the crew intimately by name, and he had some lifelong friends that had trained with him.
HMS Kent was given temporary repairs, allowing her to return to the UK. George was then transferred to a new command. He was soon back on convoy duty. Final victory in the Battle of the Mediterranean cost the Royal Navy 140 ships and submarines sunk. He was fighting it out in the Mediterranean. There was another bitter battle occurring on its southern shores, in North Africa. Hitler and his allies had spent the last 2 years trying to throw the British out of Libya and Egypt. His plans almost the start of a new Allied offensive. Within hours, the BBC heralded a major breakthrough. The Battle of El Alamein was the first major British victory of the war.
And by shattering the enemy forces in the desert, to open the road for whatever offensive might follow. This would be the culminating struggle between the Axis and the Army of Freedom.
Despite the government restrictions, several soldiers used their personal cameras to record this turning point in the war. This is the first time they have been shown together. A sergeant in the Royal Horse Artillery filmed one of the more than 1,000 guns that pounded the German defenders.
Shells by the thousand are being pumped into the enemy. And now here we are at the side of one of these desert tracks.
One of the men holds up an unexploded German shell for the camera. The speed of the British breakthrough can be seen through the camera of a signaller in the Middlesex Yeomanry as he passed burning German vehicles. The Germans and Italians lost over 50,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured.
The sound you can hear now is the noise of British tanks moving into battle.
The battle lasted for over 10 days, and it was the beginning of the end for the Germans in North Africa. But Allied casualties were high too. Almost 14,000 men wounded or killed. One of them was George Blundell's brother, who was serving in the Royal Engineers.
Dad was serving in the Mediterranean with the convoys, the Malta convoys, and Jack was only a short distance geographically away in North Africa, part of a team building a road, and he unfortunately was hit by a shell, lost both his legs, and before they could get help to him, he bled to death. Although you must know in a war that it could be inevitable, I think the loss of your elder brother is a terrible thing. And Dad always used to say that his mother really never got over it. It shook her to the core.
By 1943, the war had been underway for over 3 years, and back in Britain, with almost all of life's essentials now rationed, everyone was expected to do their bit. At Elworth School in Cheshire, the children were filmed learning to scrimp and save anything that could be recycled. And also to grow their own food, to dig for victory. Another way that people were asked to help was by digging into their own pockets. In Cardiff, a local cameraman filmed the mayor as he appealed to his citizens to continue lending their own money for the war effort.
You're only asked to lend this money to the government. They're not asking you to give it away for nothing. And you'll be getting interest on it right up to the end of the war.
All over the country, special warship weeks encouraged people to raise money to sponsor new ships for the Navy. Amateur cameraman William Greenall recorded his own townspeople's efforts. Together, they contributed over £200,000. Based on its population, each local region was given a savings target. Every community was expected to take part, even the smallest, such as Aspley Gees in Bedfordshire, where a special fundraising barometer was erected in the village square. The scheme was a huge success. Some communities exceeded their targets by a factor of 3. By the end of the war, almost £1 billion had been raised to buy weapons and ammunition. A much-needed boost to morale. For some of the war news was still bleak. After their devastating strike against the American Navy at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had extended their control over vast swathes of the Pacific and the Far East. Almost all of Britain's colonial territories had fallen. The future of Britain's empire was under threat. So in the small town of Louth, in rural Lincolnshire, 2 amateur filmmakers took it on themselves to raise their neighbours' spirits by producing a series of comic local newsreels. They would film a serious subject and inject it with their own brand of humour. The amateur films they made are a unique insight into a local community at war. This is the first time they have been broadcast at length.
Out of a population of 9,678, the little Lincolnshire town of Louth has 9,677 film actors. Mr. G.H. Hallam and Mr. Rawlings of the Playhouse Cinema make what they can of real, live, uncensored news. Mr. Hallam owned the cinema, and Dad was the projectionist at the cinema. And they were local, and that used to pull the people in because there were no televisions in those days. So they
liked to see themselves and friends on film, didn't they?
That's right.
But I think Mr. Hallam, he had the equipment and the money and the lovely cameras and so on. And my dad, he was the man, he was the technician, wasn't he?
That's
Behind the camera, he knew how to do it. And I think Mr. Hallam recognised that. And between them, they were a good partnership, weren't they?
They were very good. They complemented each other extremely well, I think.
So I think they both had a bit of a dry sense of humour and were able to put a sort of comic slant to these serious events.
I met Bert Hallam on many occasions. He was a most delightful person. He liked to amuse people and entertain them.
In one early film, they recorded the local emergency services demonstrating how, and how not, to deal with incendiary bombs, a real danger during Hitler's blitz of Britain's cities. As always, they had an eye for anything comic.
They made a very good team because they both had the interest in film production. Bert was very much the showman. Bert Rawlings, he was the one who could actually deliver the technical side of it. He joined the cinema at quite a young age. I think he was only about 16 as the projectionist at the cinema.
And Dad, as a person, he was very... he played with us a lot, didn't he? He played... he allowed us to play with him. We used to dress his hair, which is, I know sounds silly, but we used to play with his hair, as girls sometimes do. And he was quite happy with that.
The actual performance of these films was an amazing procedure. And it involved the three people up in the projection box. There was Bert Rawlings was managing this amazing projector which he had devised. Bert Hallam would then do commentary live on mic. And he'd always be in the foyer as the audience arrived. And he would always vary his script a little to include a mention to people that he knew was in the audience. The Berts saw events in the same way as the public saw them. And that got the positive reaction.
The film was so popular that fans wrote to say that it was better than Snow White. We kept the news from Walt Disney, said Mr. Hallam, but it was good to get our own fan mail.
I had no idea it had made national news, and I think it's something to be proud of, really. I didn't realise how in such high regard that the people of Louth regarded the two Berts.
In the dark days that followed the fall of France, in an effort to disrupt Hitler's plans, Prime Minister Churchill had started a secret war. Specially trained agents were sent to occupied Europe to sabotage and subvert the enemy's plans, part of an organisation known as the SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service. Despite the covert nature of his operation, amazingly, one of them made a film of his exploits. On the 20th of April 1943, secret agent Olaf Reed Olsen was one of 3 men who parachuted into Nazi-occupied Norway. He was later recorded recounting his secret mission.
Well, that was one parachute jump I would just as soon never repeat. I had to be at a certain place in Norway on a definite date. Twice we flew over the place where I had to jump.
During his jump, Olaf hit the tail of the plane and dislocated his knee.
Fortunately, I came down on a forest of tall pines. I was scratched up rather badly. First I had to snap my right knee back into normal position. Then I was able to move about, though somewhat painfully. My first job was to climb the tree and remove the parachute so that no rowing German patrol plane would spot it and lead the Gestapo to me.
Olaf's mission was to set up a secret radio station in the forests around Norway's capital, Oslo, and to make regular reports on German shipping in the fjord.
It was more of a trip than we had bargained for. With 2 companions, I had been busy for several months taking pictures of German military installations. One day I was caught while snapping views of a naval base. The stupid German guard who stopped me was so flattered by my praise of the mighty German ships that he permitted me to keep my camera and film.
Olaf survived his mission, and after the war was awarded Norway's highest medal for bravery.
It's interesting to look back on, but it was far from pleasant at the time.
2,000 miles to the south, after defeating the Germans in North Africa, the Allies were then able to invade Sicily. And on September the 3rd, 1943, the Italians surrendered. In Europe, Hitler now fought on alone. For the past 3 years, the Allies had been pounding Hitler's Germany from the air. In 1943, an amateur filmmaker at a base in Lincolnshire decided to make a training film for new recruits, to prepare them for the rigours of the job. After the war, under government censorship, it lay hidden in a bank vault for 35 years. It's the most complete film of a bomber command squadron in action. It began with showing Lancaster bombers as they were prepared for a raid. The planes were loaded with high explosive bombs and incendiaries, up to 10 tons at a time.
We do our operations in Lancaster A for Anzac, a wizard kite that has never let us down. My ground staff boys call it the pride of the squadron, and if I chance to bring it home with an occasional howl, I feel duly humiliated to have to report the fact to them.
At first, the RAF's Bomber Command had restricted itself to attacking military targets. But after Hitler's blitz of Britain's cities, it began to target industrial areas and the workforce itself in an effort to undermine the morale of the German civilian population. The war, more than 125,000 men served in Bomber Command. One of them was Flight Sergeant Hayden Davies.
He volunteered in 1939 for the Royal Air Force. And of course, what I thought is very, very brave, like 58,000 other young men were brave, they were all volunteers. Before the war, he worked as an engineer in the power station at Swansea. And I used to wait for him to come home from work. And he would bend down, I would take his cap off, and there would be a bar of Fry's chocolate for me. He went on 19 missions up to 1943. He went on bombing missions, the 1,000 bomber raid, in fact, to Berlin. He went to Italy, to Turin, bombing the Fiat factory. And he did lots of interesting exploits.
This extraordinary amateur film contains the only colour film of a 1944 raid over Germany as Hitler's capital, Berlin, is bombed. Part of a controversial bombing campaign that by the war's end had killed between 350 and 600,000 German civilians. For its air crews, Bomber Command was also a highly dangerous posting. The casualty rate was one of the war's highest, at almost 50%.
And I was so very, very happy to see my grandfather. But when I got up to my grandfather, he said, "Raymond, I've come to tell you that your father has been shot down over Germany." Of course, at that time, I'm age 6, I thought, well, he must have bailed out. He's probably a prisoner of war. I never thought of death. But when I got home, my mother had received a telegram, And my brother Geoffrey has got that telegram to this day.
Obviously, at 9 months old when my father died, it's impossible to remember anything about him. But the interesting thing is, I built up a picture. A person of 26, I've got a grandson, 26 at the moment. And so it's close to home. And a brave man going off to war, like many, many thousands others, and not returning. And that is the picture I built up and continue to build up throughout my lifetime, effectively.
All of us oldies used to listen to Lord Haw Haw. He was a traitor, and he used to broadcast from Germany the names of the prisoners of war at Stalag Luft 3 prisoner of war camp. Of course, as the months and the years went by, we did not hear my father's name. But it was a gradual process of acceptance that he wasn't coming back. It had a devastating effect on my mother. Imagine having 2 young boys, and she was only in her 20s.
You realize that you haven't got a father, so you've got to sort of carry on life and build up from there. One day I went to the cenotaph with my mother and my brother. I was about 3, 4, Raymond 6 years older, and without saying anything to my mother or my grandmother, who we lived with at the time, I got my father's medals and I put them on my coat. I got my toy drum and put it around my neck and got to the back of the RAF marching and started to beat my drum. And I found the whole thing very emotional. So from that stage on, I knew what had happened to my father.
Yes, we got over bereavement, I think, but we never got over the fact that we once had a father, a decent father, and we wanted to know what happened.
The RAF didn't provide any additional information, so we could not pinpoint exactly what had happened. All we knew that and neither could my mother.
She tried very hard to find out what had happened to my father. She got a closure letter from the Air Ministry. They confirmed that his aircraft was shot down over Hanover, but that was closure. They said they had no further information. So over the years, I took up the baton, and later my brother took up the baton to try and find out exactly what did happen to the crew of EML. The years went by and I almost gave up until my last effort, the year 2000, I put on Bomber Command website a request. Does anyone know what happened to Lancaster Bomber EML of 207 Squadron? I didn't get one single reply. Until after 16 years, I get an email. And I get an email from a German researcher called Dirk Hartmann. Dirk Hartmann said, I can tell you what happened to your father.
In 2016, more than 70 years after their father's death, Ray and Jeff travelled to Germany with their families. A local researcher had painstakingly put together the last moments of their father's plane.
We went to the actual field where Lancaster EML crashed.
And we met a lovely old man, probably in his sort of early 90s. And he, when he was 12, had witnessed my father's plane coming down. And all he saw coming towards him was a ball of fire. And suddenly there was an explosion.
We actually found 4 pieces of the Lancaster. I have got to this day the oil cap, which is very precious because that's all I've got of my father, really. and my brother's got the other 3 pieces of perspex and metal.
And to be actually standing on the same spot where your father died, and then to be told that in the German report that night they visited the site, found 6 bodies. 2, the pilot Negus, who was 19, Stringer, another member of the crew, both identified, and then they found 4 charred bodies. They'd been cremated.
We have got a copy of the German pilot's log when he said he approached the Lancaster over Ronenberg at 8:30 in the evening, and the aircraft was coned by 4 searchlights, and he set the Lancaster on fire. In 1 hour, they shut down 9. War is a horrible, horrible thing. They took 8 coffins to Ronenberg Cemetery and then transferred them to Hanover War Cemetery. And to this day, the gravestones say, unidentified airmen. We now know who those airmen were, and my father was one of them.
Yeah, it's good to see old England again anyway. Yeah, after that long. Boy, that's a sight for sore eyes, that is.
By December 1943, with Germany and Japan on the retreat, the 3 Allied leaders, Winston Churchill, American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Russian leader Joseph Stalin, met together for the first time in Iran's capital, Tehran, and agreed to deal Hitler's Nazis a final blow. For the next 6 months, the planning for an invasion of Europe, D-Day, began in earnest. An amateur filmmaker, a naval lieutenant, filmed the final preparations on his personal camera. It is one of the very few amateur films taken of these momentous events. On the 6th of June, the invasion fleet gathered in Southampton Harbour before starting to cross the Channel.
D-Day has come. Early this morning, the Allies began the assault on the northwestern face of Hitler's European forces. Under the command of General Eisenhower, Allied naval forces, supported by strong air forces, began landing Allied armies this morning on the northern coast of France.
Lieutenant Serralier was serving on an infantry landing ship, HMS Queen Emma, one of the almost 7,000 ships that landed 133,000 Allied troops on 5 beachheads in Normandy, France. The fighting was brutal. Another amateur cameraman filmed some of the first casualties. On day 1, over 5,000 Allied soldiers were killed. But the landings were a huge success. The liberation of Europe had begun. In the days after D-Day, the fighting was fierce as the Germans were forced onto the retreat on all fronts. In the West, British and American aircraft now had almost total superiority to attack German troops at will. By late 1944, France and Belgium had been liberated. In the east, huge Soviet armies were beginning to overwhelm Hitler's forces and were now approaching the borders of Germany itself. As the Allied advance progressed, several Nazi strongholds were bypassed. One of the biggest was the only part of the British Isles to be occupied by the Nazis: the Channel Islands. The invaders had arrived shortly after the fall of France in 1940. Before restrictions were imposed, one Jersey Islander recorded the early days of the occupation, as Jersey's beaches were used for German military exercises. And the island's capital, St. Helier, became a Nazi parade ground. These fragments are some of the only uncensored film records of British life under Nazi occupation. This freedom didn't last long. Soon cameras were banned under pain of imprisonment and even death. Michael Vautier was a schoolboy on Jersey during the German occupation.
The farm we lived on, because of its isolation, we thought we were quite safe from prying eyes and from the Germans, but in fact we were quite mistaken. Well, everything was closely monitored by the Germans. They took stock of how many cattle you had, how many hens you had, what crops you grew. You had to grow potatoes. You had to supply so much for the German troops. Certainly after the D-Day landings of June the 6th, no food was coming into the island, so food had to be grown and supplied for the local population, for the German troops, and for the prisoners.
The Germans had banned all radios, but some people kept them secretly, including Michael's parents.
My mother used to then go up to the bedroom every night to hear the news at a certain time. And she would come down and discreetly tell my father the news, or she thought discreetly. But my younger brother, in school one day, he told the teacher, "Oh, please, miss, every night my mother goes upstairs and she speaks to God, because she comes down and tells my father the news." Now, this was quite disturbing, because if they'd been found and listening to the news, they would have been imprisoned. So the teacher was quite concerned about this, and she was a friend of the family. She cycled from St. John's School down to Le Mourier, where we were, to warn my mother to be more careful in future.
Despite the restrictions, a brave few of the island's filmmakers continued to film. At great personal risk, they uncovered their cameras and recorded the German occupiers. In Jersey's capital, St. Helier, a local filmmaker secretly filmed a German parade as it marched past the town hall, and even recorded a British policeman saluting the Nazi occupiers. By the end of the war, Hitler had stationed over 36,000 troops on the islands.
They took over Rone Quarry, which was close to the farm. They installed a Russian prisoner of war camp near the quarry so that these prisoners could work in the quarry.
Hitler also imported over 16,000 slave workers to turn the islands into a military fortress. The conditions in the camps were horrifying.
I could see from my lying in bed across the valley and seeing this trench being dug by Russian prisoners and seeing them whipped and hearing the shouts and screams. That really leaves an impression on a young child. Every evening at milking time, 5 or 6 Russian prisoners used to come to the farm and were each given a glass of milk. And this went on for several months. And on one occasion, one of the prisoners, who was rather different to the others, he asked my mother for her hand, and he measured her finger, and asked my father for a coin. He came back with a ring made out of this silver 2 shilling or florin. Then the next one, he made one for my father out of half a crown. and he made one for each of us. And I still have that ring today. And after a while, he didn't come again, so we thought that he had died.
By early 1945, Germany was on its last legs. The Allies had invaded from the west, and the Russians were now fighting in the streets of Berlin itself. Then, on May 1st, 1945, the BBC announced the news everyone had been waiting for.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
Over the following days, the German army surrendered. Back in Jersey, one filmmaker had kept a reel of unused film hidden under his floor, waiting for this long-hoped-for moment, as the Channel Islanders were finally liberated on May 9th, 1945, after 5 years of occupation.
And Liberation Day, we were in St Helier. For our parents, certainly, it was a wonderful, wonderful day because they'd lived under this shadow. And out of the crowd stepped this well-dressed young man who turned out to be the Russian prisoner. He had obviously escaped and had been sheltered by someone, well-fed and well-dressed. And he came and embraced my mother and thanked her. He had a few words of English, and he thanked her for having helped him during that time.
The island's amateur filmmakers filmed the liberating troops as they landed desperately needed food and supplies. And the surviving Russian and Algerian forced labourers now freed from their Nazi guards. And the island's remaining German garrison as it was forced to surrender, more than 36,000 soldiers and sailors as they were ordered to hand over their weapons. With the war in Europe now over and Germany defeated, the question arose as to what to do with the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers that had been captured. To accommodate them, the Allies had to construct a huge network of prisoner-of-war camps. In the UK alone, by the war's end, there were over 1,000, spread all over the country, containing over 400,000 German and Italian prisoners. The last camp wasn't closed until 2 years after the end of the war. POW Camp 633 was located near the village of Booton in Nottinghamshire. It was filmed by one of the guards on his own camera.
My father volunteered to work in the POW camp at Booton because he could speak German. Because he was so interested in filmmaking, he thought he ought to make a sort of a documentary of what it was like here.
Sergeant Reekin later recorded his own commentary.
Our first task was to retain the 1,000 or so prisoners of war who were already there in accordance with the rules and regulations of the Geneva Convention. And secondly, to commence a rehabilitation program to prepare them for their eventual repatriation to a denazified Germany.
A key part of this policy was to confront the prisoners with first-hand evidence of the many atrocities committed in their name.
The civilian gentleman walking with Major Wren was Dr. Bruckner. He was a survivor from Belsen concentration camp. He was going around the different POW camps giving lectures about his experiences.
My father was asked by the commanding officer, Major Wren, to go round the tents and listen in to the conversations after they had been to the lecture, and there was basically a lot of disgust, and a lot of people didn't, well, nobody seemed to know anything about what happened.
Most of the POWs worked each day at the Royal Army Ordnance Depot, which wasn't very far from our camp. The POWs slept under canvas all the year round. Each tent took 12 men.
They also had an area of ground outside each tent, which they cultivated as little gardens. They made little model villages with water wheels that actually worked, aspects of their homeland, where they hopefully will be home again soon.
One of the camp's prisoners was 22-year-old Siegfried Amskamp. His granddaughter has been researching his story. He never talked about his experiences and died before she was born. All she has to go on are a handful of photographs and a few letters.
Letzten Sonntag haben wir ein kleines Sportfest veranstaltet. Kameraden aus einem anderen Lager sind eingeladen worden, gegen unser Unterlager anzutreten. Es war ein sehr schöner Sonntag. Man redet jetzt jeden Tag mehr von unserer Heimkehr. Die Zeitungen stehen voll davon. Hoffentlich wird es bald in die Tat umgesetzt.
Through the Imperial War Museum in London, Laura managed to track down Paul Wrekin and to watch his father's film for the first time.
On most Sundays, a church parade was organised. We had to march the POWs about 3/4 of a mile to the village church at Booton. It must be said, it was quite a relaxed and enjoyable duty to perform.
And to her amazement, Laura was even able to spot her grandfather.
I'm so lucky in that I found Paul and met him, and I could even find my grandfather in the film. Growing up as a German grandchild to a German prisoner of war, we never talked about it, and my grandmother never talked about it. We have only 5 or 6 pictures from a whole decade between 1940 and 1950. And it's part of family history we never talked about.
This is the first time that Laura has been to the site of the POW camp where her grandfather was imprisoned over 70 years ago.
I never knew my grandfather, actually. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to find out who he was and how he lived. And this is very emotional for me as well, to see where he's been and which ways he has walked and where on the fields where he's lived for some time, to actually understand how he turned out to be the man he is and how he actually also formed his children, which is my father now. Being here in the place where he was in 1946, he somehow came closer to me, and I really now have a connection to him.
Siegfried Amskamp was finally repatriated to Germany on November the 30th, 1947. But he returned to a country in ruins. Many of the cities and towns had been devastated by the Allied bombing campaign. An interpreter with the British occupying forces captured some of it on his own personal camera. He filmed in the industrial cities of Mainz and Essen, home to Germany's steel industry, run by the Krupp family. Its head, Alfred Krupp, was later convicted for war crimes and sent to prison for 12 years. As German civilians picked through the ruins, even hardened BBC reporters were shocked by what they saw.
An air of depression and hopelessness seems to charge the very atmosphere. They are no longer human habitations, but mere stone husks, often blackened and burnt out from end to end.
You have to keep reminding yourself that these are the people who at least committed these appalling atrocities, of which we're getting more ghastly proofs every day.
Germany remained occupied by the victorious Allies until 1955. In Britain, the contrast in mood could not have been greater. After almost 6 years of war, there was a mass celebration of the long-awaited victory. In London, an estimated 1 million people took to the streets as Winston Churchill announced the victory.
In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this.
We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing. But let us not forget for a moment the toils and efforts that lie ahead. Japan, with all her treachery and greed, remains unsubdued.
All around the country, people spontaneously went out onto the streets to share the good news with their neighbours, as here on the south coast in Brighton. In the northeast of England, in Gateshead, an off-duty policeman, John McHugh, used his own camera to record his neighbours' joy after years of blackouts, bombs and ration cards. But the war in the Pacific against Japan continued for another 3 months. The dropping of 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally caused Japan to surrender, unconditionally. Total victory had only been won with a massive human cost. An estimated final death toll of between 50 and 80 million people. Despite the many wartime restrictions, Britain's amateur filmmakers recorded all aspects of their life at home and on the war front through 6 long years of conflict. From pre-war holidays in Nazi Germany to the Blitz of Sheffield, from a Quaker home for child evacuees to the war at sea, from the Home Guard to the Nazi occupation of the Channel Islands. These unique amateur films have provided us with a new personal insight full of fascinating, intimate stories and the most heartrending tragedy that can only enrich our understanding of the greatest conflict in British history.
Bringing you more breathtaking footage here on BBC4, meet Britain's greatest pilot, the extraordinary story of Captain Winkle Brown and his Second World War encounters with the Nazis, next.